Hello, welcome back to Hydroponics Daily. Today is currently 29 degrees Celsius. No idea what that is in Fahrenheit, but it is flipping hot. So I'm afraid I've got the windows open and you'll hear birds cheeping and motorbikes roaring. Is that the word, what a motorbike does? Anyway, yeah. So I'm afraid I'm not in a soundproof room today because it's just too hot to do that. I thought I would cover today establishing seedlings in hydroponic systems, because that's what I am battling with at the moment in my own hydroponic grow. So we're setting up an NFT system in the labs, a new NFT system. We've run NFT systems numerous times before, but we're setting up a new one to grow blackgrass, chilies and hops and spring onions. And when you grow certain hydroponic crops, it can be difficult establishing the seedlings, getting them going. There's two options, really. The first is like if you're growing lettuce or leafy greens, you sow them in the trays that they're going to be harvested in, and that's that. You don't need to space them out, pot them up, anything like that. Or if you're growing in cocoa or soil, you can just grow them in plugs and hand water them, and then you pot them up into different sized containers. However, you're growing in NFT, in slabs or anything like that, or deep water culture, how do you get that seedling to start and then develop and then finally get into the much larger container or the much larger slab? Now, you can sow directly into the system. However, you have to then run a large slab or a large system continually when you've got these tiny little plants. And the light, you're wasting a lot of light, you're wasting a lot of nutrients, you get an algae buildup. So you want to use as small a system as possible when you're setting up your seedlings. You almost want a mini version of the system that you're going to run. And so you can sometimes, say you're growing a rock wool, you can cut with a sharp knife a section off the rock wool and then put that in a tray and then just sow your seeds on top and then hand water them every day. That works perfectly well. However, there are a couple of disadvantages of this. It's not a continuous recirculating system, unlike NFT or DWC. So your slabs can dry out and you can get localized salt buildup, and algae loves that sort of system. So because there's no cover on the rock wool, the mineral wool. So that's one option, but it's not ideal. So you can get dedicated aeroponic systems for cuttings and seedlings, like mini small scale ones. You can use a crack key method for the seedlings. So just like have a reservoir that sits there that's not being pumped, it's not being aerated. However, what I've set up today, I think is probably the best method. And I'll share a picture as the artwork for this episode, and I'll share that on social media as well. If you go to the Utrema or the Liquid Gold or Gold Leaf page, you'll see a picture of what I've set up today for my NFT system. And the great thing about this system is it's ridiculously cheap. I think it must have cost me less than 30 British pounds to set up easily. So what it is a black bucket, which is going to hold the reservoir of nutrients, a £10 pump off eBay, because it's not worth going to a grow shop for a tiny little, the lowest powered pump you can get. Then that's connected to a 4mm pipe. So I've had to use a buy on eBay a reducer from 13 to 4mm, and then cut a little hole in the top of the bucket lid, and that pipe then goes into a plant pot that's sitting on top of the bucket, on the bucket lid, and in there is volcanic rock. And then I've got 4 little sprinklers around the volcanic rock that my seedlings are going to be either sown directly into, or I'm going to have little rock wool plugs that they're going to sit within the volcanic rock. I've not put the volcanic rock straight into the plant pot because it will all just seep out, so back into the bucket. So I've put a brewing bag, sieve bag. So what they like when they is it mash when they're brewing, they have like a 400 mesh micron filter bag that all the hops and the barley goes in, and I've used one of those to contain all the volcanic rock in the container. And as I say, it's a cheap pump. And then other things I've done, you always make sure you rinse the volcanic rock and the rock wool before you set up the NFT, any NFT system, always run it a few times and then rinse and throw that water away, and then run it once with the nutrients in as well, so that it's all nice and even. I've actually ran this with, I got what's called a Milton tablet, basically releases chlorine gas into the system, and to sterilize the whole system as well, because I thought it needed that, because some of the buckets had been used before for cocoa, so I didn't want any microbial contamination in there. Obviously, I cleaned everything beforehand and scrubbed everything clean, because you can't just rely on sterilization. You've actually got to clean things. And then tomorrow I'll be sowing the seeds directly into rock wool plugs that will sit in the volcanic rock, and I'll add the fertigation solution. I'll be adding gold leaf, or liquid gold as it's called in the UK, at probably around 1 ml per litre. So that will buffer everything, it'll dechlorinate everything, and it'll add some nutrients to get the seeds germinating, as well as providing the nutrients for growth. A lot of seeds germinate faster if they're given nutrition as well. So things like nitrates are a really good signal to plants that it's time to germinate and actually promote earlier flowering. So from that, once those seeds have germinated into the plugs, the rock wool plugs, I can then take those plugs and then put them into our full system, which has got 1 meter rock wool slabs in it, and then a much more powerful pump, and then in gullies and drains, and the final setup. So that's what we'll be doing. And then you'll also notice a lot of growers, you'll see almost like a pyramid. You'll see the plug that's then planted into I think it's about 10 centimetres by 10 centimetre by 10 centimetre cube. And then that cube is finally put into the 1 metre slabs. And that's rock wool, or mineral wool as you call it. And they use that system commercially for things like tomatoes. But you can also get those exact same dimensions in cocoa and coir if you're using them. So at the Green Tech show last week, you will see the small cocoa plugs, the small cocoa squares, and then the cocoa slabs, which basically mimics the whole rock wool NFT system. But for this one, I've gone for rock wool within volcanic rock for the seedlings. And then my hope is that for spring onions, I can replicate this system and actually use this small scale NFT bucket system as almost like a mini system for growing spring onions from seed through to harvest. Whereas for most of my other crops, things like tomatoes, cucumbers, what else would we growing? Chilies, hops. What else could we grow in this sort of system? Any sort of, not perennial, but large plants. We don't want to be, this is not our final system. We're using this to get our seedlings. We don't want to be using anything soil-based, anything that's going to create a lot of contamination in the NFT system. So you might say, oh, just plant your seedlings in seedling compost and then wash them off, all the soil off them, and then put them into the NFT system. Well, the soil is going to contain loads of microbes that are just going to contaminate the NFT system as soon as they're planted in, and we don't want that. We want to keep these plants as clean as possible, and I think this is probably the best method. So that's one way of going for seedling establishment in hydroponics. It's very difficult. It's probably one of the most difficult parts of hydroponics, because if you're going to get an issue with a nutrient deficiency, it's going to really scupper and slow down the plants when you try and establish them. If you get lettuce can grow to harvest in 6 to 8 weeks in hydroponics, but if you don't get the things right during establishment, they can just sit there as a seedling for weeks and weeks and weeks and do nothing. They don't look like anything's wrong, but one factor is wrong, and the whole system will just sit there and go, no, I'm not going to grow until I'm given the secret sauce. And the same with lots of different plants like that. So seedling establishment is very important in hydroponics. And the reason I'm using the volcanic rock is that it provides a lot of moisture backup in case the system falters, and so the rock wool can suck water in from the volcanic rock around it, and also the delicate roots that might appear from the rock wool plugs, they're not going to be damaged when I try and remove the plug from the system. And hopefully this will be a good system, but I'll let you know how we get on with it and update you later on. If you've got a better way of establishing seedlings, then let me know. As I say, a lot of people just rely on passive reservoirs that aren't recirculated or hand watering their plugs. If you are a very large grower, a commercial a nursery or hydroponic system, then obviously you could have a whole NFT system, a whole tray of ebb and flood dedicated just to establishing small plugs, and that would be the perfect system. You could have a whole recirculatory system that was like a mini version of the system that they were going to go into. And if you're a large grower, you can do that. But for smaller, mid-sized growers and hobbyists, that's not possible. You can't have just a smaller version. You can't just have one tray that then would go into 2,000 trays. That just wouldn't be possible. So that's a nice thing about being a massive grower, isn't it? You can just have a mini system for seedling establishment and seedling growing on. If you've found this podcast useful, then you're welcome. If you know somebody who's struggling with seedling establishment, then please share this podcast with them. And if you've had this podcast shared with you, then you owe the person who shared it with you a pint. So go down the pub, buy them a drink. And if you could do a screenshot of this podcast as it appears on your smartphone and share it to social media, that would mean the world to me, because it would help share this hydroponics podcast with the wider horticultural community. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Tomorrow I'll have another absolute banger of an episode for you. Until then, goodbye.